So in this video, we are going to start making the game Pong. So that classic game where you have two paddles, one on each side that is bouncing the ball back and forth between them, and they're trying to score the goal in the opposite side. It's kind of like playing air hockey or something like that. So let's jump right into getting the different pieces into the game. So the first thing we want to do is to get a ball that can live in this world and it can start to move around and bounce. So there's going to be lots of different pieces in this game that interact. So I mentioned that you're going to have the ball moving around. You have one paddle, you have another paddle, you have a goal on one side, the other goal on the other side. So once we start to think about each of those objects interacting with each other, we can see how it's going to start to get more complex. So we want to set things up in a way where we're handling those objects as pieces. So that's opposed to where we used to just have a whole long list of variables. So if you think about all of the pieces of data we're going to have to keep track of to make this game work, it would be a very long list of variables here. So we're going to organize things into objects. That way we only have to think about how the ball interacts with the paddle, and then the other paddle, how the ball might interact with the goal, so that we can make our code a little bit more efficient and also to make it easier to understand as we are coding it and as we want to make changes to it. So with that, the first thing we're going to do is to make a variable called ball. All right, so instead of doing like X and Y and all those immediately, we're going to think about having the ball be an object itself. So I'm going to use this syntax to create an empty object. And this is the style that I like to use for the introduction class. I like to keep each line to be something very specific. So you might see people creating objects on the internet in a different way in JavaScript. I just like to use this style for the introduction class. All right, so if I define it as an empty object, then I can set each of its attributes here. So I can say like ball.x equals, let's say, 200. Right, so the dot kind of represents that we're getting a little bit more specific into this object here. That by saying .x, we mean that x is a property of the ball object. So then we can make more properties of it too. Say ball.y. I'm going to also set that to 200. We can set the color of the ball. Now I'm actually going to keep things fairly simple. So leave it kind of the way it's going to be to really look like that classic Pong game where we have, we'll change the background a little bit to make it black, and then to leave the balls is basically like a white or a light gray color. But it should also have a width that would be good to have as an attribute that we actually keep track of. So maybe 30, more like 20. Okay. And we're going to get into it also having a velocity. So let's kind of put a pin in that, and then we'll come back to making a couple changes there. All right, so how can I then use these properties to actually draw it and then eventually move it? So when I go into the draw function, here is where I would start the process of drawing the ball itself. But I actually think that I want to separate things out a little bit more. I want to keep styling my code in a way that makes it more efficient and more easy to manage as I keep going forward. So I'm actually going to make a new function to handle the whole drawing the ball. So I'm going to say function draw ball. All right, so in here, inside the function here, so I type the word function, the name of my function, empty parentheses, possibly I put something there in the future, but not for now, and then curly braces here to define where the function starts and stops. What are the statements that belong to this function? So then I'll use the circle function. Functions we almost always put parentheses after, and what we're going to see in this class at least. So then inside of here, I'm going to define what is the x and the y and the width of the circle that I want to see. Well, that very much has to do with the properties of the ball. So I'm going to say ball dot x, comma, ball dot y, comma, ball dot width. Okay, just zoom out a little so it's not wrapping on the next line too much. All right, so you can see how that statement works. All right, so again, I'm saying ball dot x, ball dot y, ball dot width, really in the same way that I did things up here, which is kind of why I like to use this style. Right, so that way I'm able to access those properties, but of the ball. So it's like this entire phrase, ball dot x, is the number 200. All right, same with y and width. We can get the values that they are. Now, if I press play, notice that we don't even see the ball here. That's because I isolated the instructions for how to draw the ball into a function called draw ball. When I am working with these functions, which is useful and a good way to organize code, I have to do my second step though. I defined the function, but in order to make that code happen, I have to define it and call it. Because I have to think, when do I want this to happen? How often do I want it to happen? So I have to specify that kind of stuff. So that's within the draw function in general, is to say draw ball. By just mentioning the function by name and then having the parentheses there, this calls the function. So this tells it to actually happen. Right, so I got it to show up. Now I want to think about adding in the ball being able to move. So I'm going to go back up to the properties of the ball here. And I don't have velocity yet, so I'm going to add that feature. Now I am going to adjust things slightly because the whole idea of using these objects here is to combine properties together they're different, but they're kind of similar. So all of these properties like x, y, and width, they all belong to the ball. So that's why I even created ball as an object. But x and y themselves they have something in common. And then the velocity numbers, those have something in common. So I'm even going to make one more layer of organization here. So before I do ball.x, I'm going to say ball dot pos, POS, equals an empty object. All right, I'm just going to write a comment here that just says position. This is a very commonly used abbreviation. It stands for position, and I pronounce it pos. So then I'm going to change this slightly. Instead of just saying ball.x, I'm going to actually make that be ball.pos.x, and then ball.pos.y, because I'm going to do my velocity in a very similar way. I'm going to say ball.vel equals curly braces, right? And I'm just going to write a little comment here that says velocity. It's a fairly commonly used abbreviation, so I'm comfortable with using that. And then I will say ball.vel.x equals 1, and ball.vel.y equals 1 as well. Right, so now I built a little bit of structure here, but it really combined these two numbers, like the x and the y numbers, that do have something in common. Right, they're either belonging to their position or to the velocity. And there are things that this pays off for when you get into more and more complicated programs. But if nothing else, I think it does help to make things a little bit more readable. I am, instead of using these abbreviations, though, I am just going to go ahead and spell them out. But instead of pause, I'll go ahead and say position, position, position. And then for here, I'm going to say velocity, velocity, velocity. This kind of proves that they don't matter exactly what they are. We just need to be consistent. So I'm going to go ahead and spell everything. Now I changed the x and the y thing, so when I go to draw the circle, notice how it doesn't work. So I am going to make that adjustment here. So when I draw the circle, I'm doing so with ball.position.x x ball dot position dot y, and then it's still ball dot width. I didn't change the way that width worked. And then to get it to move is something I'm actually going to save for the next video.